Hello and welcome everybody to the fourth episode of the cEDH cast. My name is Ian and with me always is my co-host Braden.
Hey guys!
On this week's episode we are going to be talking about a number of subtopics, including flex spots in the Fish Hulk list, tough cards in cEDH and how to analyze them, the staples list created by Playing with Power, and some other small things in the community. But first, before we get into any of that, we have our patron shout out. Braden, hit us up.
Alright, so this week our patron is Kixar. Kixar is actually someone we already know. He's an artist and he'll actually be at the Commander tournament that will be in Pennsylvania next month.
That's awesome. Kixar, thank you very much.
Thank you, Kixar, for all your support on the Patreon, and we also appreciate all the support we've gotten from all the other patrons. The money we get from that helps pay for the SoundCloud account and helps pay for the better microphone I'll be getting in just a couple weeks.
Yeah, I can't stress enough how much the support has been really helpful. We have smashed some Patreon goals that we weren't expecting to get to a long time, so really from the bottom of our hearts, thank you all. Now moving on to the first topic of this week, we are going to be talking about the flex spots that we are playing in our Fish Hulk decks. So both Braden and I got the opportunity to sleeve up our new Overlord this week, and we're just talking about the cards that we have slotted in. As people know, the Oracle Core was a deck list released. We will include it in the information below. The Oracle Core is 94 cards that several authors compiled, basically saying this is the way that you should be playing the Oracle Fish Hulk deck. Now there have been variations and there's a number of slots that are not concrete, and these slots depend on the person and the playstyle they're attempting to achieve with this deck. So we're each going to talk about the cards we've been using.
I actually think there's less flex slots than are advertised. I noticed that you and I have a few flex slots in common, and I actually think that there isn't as much room within this deck that I'd actually want to be playing around in as I expected the first time I played it.
In my opinion, I think there's like 3.
I think there are 3 flex spots. I agree. I think there are actually, I had the exact same number in my head. 3 is the correct number of flex slots. The 3 flex slots that I'm sure me and Ian both think aren't really flex spots, I'm just going to go over real quickly. The first one's Dark Ritual, and you're playing that largely because of the next flex spot, Necropotence. And then finally, we have our third card that we consider pretty much a must-have, not even really a flex slot, is Rhystic Study. Dark Ritual allows you to cast your Necropotence and your Ad Nauseam very aggressively after you've tried to go off or before you've tried to go off, basically ahead of curve. It's been very powerful in the games I've played. I can't imagine cutting the card right now with Ad Nauseam and Necropotence in the deck.
Yeah, it's actually pretty crazy. The past week I have played probably about 7 games, or actually just a Monday night I played about 7 games when I was playing at one of my local stores, and Dark Ritual was actually the card that decided each of those games. It was absolutely insane. I just think that Dark Ritual is a card that is very well positioned right now and not a card to be underlooked.
Necropotence in this deck is insane. I think it's very powerful. And when it comes to Rhystic Study, I just think a lot of the times you just want to jam a Rhystic Study on turn 1 or turn 2, and that lets you slow down the other Fish Hulk players and also lets you slow down a lot of the other decks that aren't able to put out their resources before you play the Rhystic Study. I don't think it's something you can possibly play on turn 3. I would never even consider keeping a hand where the game plan was a turn 3 Rhystic Study, but a turn 1 or turn 2 Rhystic Study is very powerful, I found.
Yeah, one thing that I find very important is a lot of mentality with playing Mystic Remora is the fact that you not only have to plan for playing the Mystic Remora at the time when you expect your opponent to cast the most non-creature spells, but you also have to plan for it to be around later in the game, and you have to plan for that cumulative upkeep cost. If you can get that turn 2 Rhystic Study, 1, they're paying for their mana dorks. You're not worried about the types of cards they're casting. And 2, it's just such a pervasive effect that as soon as it slams down, you are set. You're either gaining card advantage or you're tempoing your opponent so hard. And right now, with Flash being the pervasive archetype, having a tempo on your opponents is pretty amazing. Like, every single mana counts in this format right now, and I think that's more than ever, to be honest.
I don't want to get too deep into this topic because it is very controversial, and I think we could devote a whole episodes to it. Some people would call Rhystic Study a tempo piece. I think that's fair. I think it's very close to a stacks piece. They're basically the same thing in my mind. Let's say it is a tempo piece. I think Flash is also a tempo piece. Once your opponents know you have a Flash, if they're playing correctly, just like if they're playing correctly with Rhystic Study, you just gain a huge amount of mana tempo on them. Over the course of the game, they can't, activate a Thrasios, they can't tap out for a Mana Rock, they can't progress their board state, really at all. And Rhystic Study also kind of does that but on the other end, it gives you card advantage when your opponents play into it, which they almost never should. Although, sometimes you do have to, but you're probably winning the game when they do that.
Right.
So yeah, I think Ristic Study goes really well into the plan of Flash being a tempo piece where it forces your opponents to not be able to play the game properly. And Ristic Study does the exact same thing. So I think they're very aligned in purpose.
I think one thing that's really important for understanding the conversation that we're having right now about why these slots are so solidified is the fact that the Fish Hulk deck is, as Braden actually mentioned to me earlier when we were talking off the cast, it's an A plus B deck. There are so many different variations of A and B, as in one card and the other create a win. So because of that, I think it's very important to realize that the more card advantage this deck has, the easier it is to win. And then not only have a single win, but maybe even layered wins, multiple wins in the hand, or several protection pieces for a single win that you've drawn.
So the next 3 flex spots, me and Ian don't agree on. And this comes from either our meta or specific playstyles or certain concerns we have about how the deck plays. So I'm just going to go off and talk about my 3, then we'll let Ian talk about his 3, and maybe we'll comment on the differences. So my first flex spot is delay. The appeal for delay for me is that my games have been incredibly short. Most games are not even getting to turn 5 or 6. That's just been my experience. The format is actually in a really unhealthy place, and so delay is just kind of insane. Additionally, delay is a counterspell that has a colorless cost, which means you can use Beseju on it, which was actually a big enough bump for me to put it over something like Drown in the Loch. Especially when the games are so short, Drown in the Loch never really gets to the high enough CMC to become relevant. And those are the 2 cards that kind of fit that slot usually for me. The next card I have is Nature's Claim. The format is very, very fast, and you need to use your mana extremely sparingly, but you also need to keep up tempo. So you basically have to pick, in my mind, if you're going to play a card like this, between Force of Vigor and Nature's Claim, and I chose Nature's Claim. If you're going to play one of these cards as a flex spot, you should be choosing between Nature's Claim and Force of Vigor. In this case, I chose Nature's Claim because I have a feeling I'm going to be holding up mana very often. I have a feeling I'm not going to have a lot of cards that I want to pitch that are green that are both losing. So it's just a slight advantage. Also, when you're playing Necropotence, I find Nature's Claim destroying your Necropotence for 1 mana has also been very useful, so you don't have to exile the cards you discard. The final card I have is Rapid Hybridization. Rapid Hybridization is just a clean 1 mana removal spell. It's blue, it pitches Force of Will. It kills our Protean Hulk, which is relevant sometimes in right into your games. It's probably the weakest flex spot, to be honest. I haven't found anything I'm really passionate about to fill this slot. I've considered a few things, like Reap. Reap is probably one, and Spell Snare is probably the other. Those are 2 cards I would be considering right now. And I guess that's all I have to say about my flex spots. Ian, would you like to talk about yours?
Yeah, so I approached the deck a little differently than most. I actually talked to Shaper's Vaunt when I was brewing my version of the deck. And by brewing, I mean like taking my flex slots into consideration. And if anyone would like, his Fish Hulk primer is actually a little different than the core. He has actually removed the Neoform and Grand Abolisher lines from his list. That's where I started. I chose some pieces to move around, so actually I ended up putting those cards back in. A little convoluted way to say I had a bunch of my flex slots informed by going off of his list before, so my 3 flex slots are Reap, Spell Snare, and Laboratory Maniac.
One thing I'd like to add is that I also started the exact same way. I should have mentioned that. I did not have Neoform and Grand Abolisher in my deck, and I eventually put those cards in because I found that they were extremely powerful when I played against the mirror match. So this is where I have ended up. It's probably why me and Ian have, very similar flex spots. We have a very similar perspective on the deck. I think we're pretty close to right. I think those last 3 flex spots are maybe meta calls or maybe just experience with the deck will reveal the correct answer.
So I'm going to break down my picks. Laboratory Maniac, that is, I think, a personal choice. I never like being left without a win con in a deck, and I'm aware that there's so many A plus B combos in the deck, and I just wanted one more. I think that having the 3rd consultation outlet is just very important to the deck, / the 3rd outlet for breakfast Hulk piles. Hypothetically speaking, they attempt to remove your Thassa's Oracle in some way, like a Praetor's Grasp, something like that. I would personally like a card that I can flash in off of a Protean Hulk that doesn't mean if I have something like a Thassa's Oracle in hand that I'm out of the game. That's kind of where I'm coming from that specific version. Reap is a card that I did get off of Shaper's list. Reap specifically, I actually haven't been able to play with the card yet. That's just part of being a 100-card singleton format, is sometimes you haven't seen a card yet. Reap, I expect to be very good because I play against a lot of either Timna Thrasios decks, Opus Thief decks, or stuff in between. And because of that, I think Reap is really that piece that can generate some card advantage as the game goes on. Additionally, I was talking with Shaper's Vaunt this week, and he mentioned a line where you get Grand Abolisher and Spellseeker. Spellseeker goes and grabs your Reap. You grab Flash and Hulk again, and you then go for the win after the Grand Abolisher has hit the table. So that's a line that I really enjoy having in the deck, and I would be reticent to cut Reap because of it. My last flex spot is Spell Snare. This is a flex spot that is a personal choice, even though Braden and I have talked about it before. When Thassa's Oracle was spoiled, Braden and I actually had a decent conversation about the utility of Spell Snare in the format. Spell Snare is not on the Oracle core. It is not suggested in the maybe board, but I find that it hits some of the most amazing cards in our format. I was checking out the list of cEDH staples that the Playing with Power group compiled, which we will go into later in the show. And going through that list, I was sorting it by converted mana cost, and the 2 mana spells are the most important spells, in my personal opinion, in this format, next to the 1 mana spells. We all know how amazing Mental Misstep is, and the 2 mana slots are extremely powerful and extremely efficient, and I think having a spell that for 1 mana cancels a Flash, 1 mana cancels a Thassa's Oracle, cancels a Gilded Drake, I could go on forever. I think the 2 mana slot is very important, and having a Spell Snare to counter that slot is equally as important.
I remember when I played Modern, a reason that Spell Snare felt especially powerful is that if you were on the draw, you could Spell Snare their 2-drop, and you'd be like crazy up on tempo. Like you spent your first turn countering their second turn. It's like a time walk. I think in the past, Spell Snare was not good enough because those types of plays don't happen often enough. But now the format is so fast. I see turn 2 flashes like consistently, which is kind of terrifying. And a 1 mana Spell Snare that you can hold up after you play, Mana Rock or something, or hold up while the Mana Rock's in the stack is very appealing right now. So I think it's something that needs to be explored. So when it comes to Reap, Reap was actually in my flex spots, those 3 flex spots. Delay is what replaced Reap. I found that the games were so fast that Reap never turned on, and I really didn't want a regrowth either. So I just decided that I think a counterspell is better, and so far it has been. If your meta isn't like everyone on Fishhulk, I think Reap is probably a much better choice, but my reality right now is that at every pod there's going to be 2 to 3 Fishhulk decks.
Yeah, I have to agree with you there. I think Delay is actually a pretty good choice, and I'm very tempted myself to switch over to that as my flex spot too. So in planning today's episode, we talked to the people in our Discord about topics they wanted to understand, and a lot of people mentioned sort of the idea that we could tackle cards in cEDH that were nuanced, and to people who were just being introduced into the format, some cards that they wouldn't get right away, or maybe wouldn't get really interesting interactions with right away. Today we're going to talk about 6 cards in cEDH that have a lot of nuance to them and that we're going to dive into to really allow you to optimize your game. The first one we're going to talk about is Ad Nauseam.
So the history of Ad Nauseam is actually kind of interesting. Before Hulk was unbanned, there was a bit of a movement going around that was trying to get the Rules Committee to ban Ad Nauseam. So at the time, basically every good deck in the format was an Ad Nauseam deck. There was way more people jamming stuff like High Tide. There really was no consultation to be heard of. The format was very different at the time. Nowadays, I think people look at Ad Nauseam as a way more fair card. The number of ways to attack people's life totals just keeps expanding, and the quality of creatures just keeps getting better. And the format is kind of in such a way that attacking people is rewarded through Timna and Najeela. So Ad Nauseam just doesn't have the extreme power level it used to. People's life totals are actually changing pretty regularly, where before that might not have happened since the decks didn't really interact using the combat step. The difficult part of Ad Nauseam is in figuring out when to stop and when to cast it. So there are a few different ways of casting Ad Nauseam. The first one I'll talk about is casting an Ad Nauseam during your opponent's turn. So sometimes your opponent has a flash or a food chain on the stack, and you have enough mana to cast your Ad Nauseam. And so you cast your Ad Nauseam and tell the table, I'm looking for an answer. And so the table might let it resolve, and you dig until you find an answer, and then maybe you dig a little extra so you have enough that you can win the game during your next turn. You counter whatever needs countered, you win whatever battle needs fought, and then when it gets back to your turn, you win the game. Or put yourself in such a position that's impossible to lose. The next category of Ad Nauseam is the classic Storm main phase Ad Nauseam. So it's your turn, maybe you have a carpet of flowers that's adding mana to your mana pool. So you're kind of incentivized to go off right now. You add 5 mana off your Carpet Flowers because there's some Urza deck, and you rip off your Ad Nauseam. You take like 30 life, or basically all the life you can, and then from there you try to piece something together. Usually these decks are on like Scepter so that they don't require like a creature to tap. If you're on a Freed from the Real combo and there's no Boom Tender in play, you probably don't want to cast an Ad Nauseam this way. Or if you're like a Wheels Stormy deck, it's usually Storm decks or decks that used to be called Storm decks, like the old Paradox Engine decks. That's another way of casting an Ad Nauseam. And finally, there is the Angel's Grace Ad Nauseam. So you cast Angel's Grace, which is a card that makes it so you can't lose the game, and then you rip off your Ad Nauseam and just draw your whole deck. You'll be at negative quite a huge number of life, but you don't die because of the Angel's Grace. Now you have your whole deck in your hands, and usually you play some type of combo like a Lab Maniac, a Thassa's Oracle, or a Infinite Mana combo so that you can start doing other things like Twister Loops. But you have to win that turn, or you have to use a card like Aetherflux Reservoir to dig yourself out of the hole, because you will be at a very low life total. You'll be at the combined cost of all the cards you revealed minus your life total, negative life total. So you have to do it then. Those are the ways that I usually see Ad Nauseam cast. The more difficult Ad Nauseam to cast is the one where you cast it during your turn and you're trying to figure out, is this an Ad Nauseam that's going to kill me? Or is this an Ad Nauseam that I'm going to use to just get ahead of my opponents? Or is this an Ad Nauseam where I'm going to win the game? And then when you're casting it at instant speed, you have to evaluate how much damage do my opponents have on board and how much can I block so you don't accidentally kill yourself as you're flipping through cards off the top of your deck at instant speed. If it's the turn before your turn, you're pretty safe because you've probably done this after their combat step, or it's only one opponent, so they can't actually deal that much damage to you. But if it's the turn right after your turn, you have to start actually doing the math and saying, like, hey, how is this Ad Nauseam going to resolve? And what's the punishment going to be? And are they going to all hold up all their resources because I just cast an Ad Nauseam? You don't want to, like, Ad Nauseam pass without some huge advantage besides cards. It's a pretty lengthy explanation. There's probably way more detail we could go into, but that's just like a top level view.
Yeah, Ad Nauseam, more than most cards in our format, the time in which you cast the spell is absolutely the most important. It's kind of like winning off of a flash in the sense that you are watching everything your opponents are doing. You're thinking about, if this person untaps, I know they have a pretty stacked hand. Are they going to be able to counter it? Or I know this person has been letting some spells go. Am I going to cast it during their turn? Or maybe you just want to wait until it's as close to your turn as possible so that there's less repercussions from the table, less opportunity for them to try to tutor for a wheel, things like that.
Another thing about Ad Nauseam is that it is about as threatening as a flash. So, like, let's say you do have your flash hook in hand. You can cast your Ad Nauseam and hope that they counter it. You're just baiting counter spells at that point. Maybe even protect it a little bit so that people go in for it. And then when you untap during your turn, you have all your resources now, and maybe you just go for it. Ad Nauseam is viewed as a I win the game card, even if it often isn't, but it can be. And I would say it probably wins the game on its own more often than it doesn't. It's a very powerful spell.
Yeah, very fair.
And it does test your player skill quite a bit. It also has some deck building constrictions. So when you build a deck around Ad Nauseam, your mana base needs to probably require very little life. So people try to avoid cards like Tarnished Citadel or the Shocklands. Additionally, your average mana cost needs to be very low so that you don't kill yourself as you flip cards over. So there are some deck building requirements which make the card a little bit more fair. There's also, your opponents can fairly punish it by attacking you and pressuring your life total. That's why a lot of times people say attack the player playing black, because Ad Nauseam is a card that basically every black deck plays. Yeah, it's a very powerful card. It's a very fun card. It's definitely a card that is one of the reasons to play competitive EDH. If you enjoy just flipping off the top and seeing what happens, that's a card that'll punish you and reward you quite a bit.
The next card we're going to talk about is Mystic Remora. Now, this card is an absolute staple of our format, and if you're playing the color blue, you've seen this card. But we like to just clear up some misnomers about the card and talk about some of the nuance in playing it. Specifically, we're going to read from the Oracle text, which is very different from the actual printed text on the card. So Mystic Remora is an enchantment for only a single blue mana. It has a cumulative upkeep of 1, which means at the beginning of your upkeep, you put an age counter on it. Then, sacrifice it unless you pay its upkeep cost for each age counter. So, Mystic Remora has a cumulative upkeep of 1 colorless mana, meaning you play it for a blue on your first turn. The next turn, on your upkeep, you put 1 counter on and you have to pay a single generic mana. The next turn, 2 generic mana, and so on. Finally, the card says whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 4. An important distinction from the written text on the card. On the Oracle text, it says whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you may draw a card unless that player pays 4. But on the written card, it says whenever target opponent. That's a very important distinction. You do not have to target when you cast Mystic Remora. It, in fact, affects each player at the table.
Is very powerful.
Yeah, understatement.
So Mystic Remora is actually a skill testing card for your opponents. So unlike Ad Nauseam, where we talked about it, and it's like, oh, this is a difficult card for you to play. Mystic Remora is a difficult card for your opponents to play. So we're going to try to give some advice for when you're playing against Mystic Remora. I think that's probably the best way for us to attack this.
Yes.
Oftentimes, when people play cards into the Mystic Remora effect, they call it feeding the fish. So if you ever heard someone say, like, hey, don't feed the fish, that's what they're talking about. Don't just play your spells into this fish and feed the opponent all these cards. So there's only a few times where it's appropriate to feed the fish, and I think I'll oversimplify it, so this is just advertising oversimplification. When your cards are better than their cards, and when you can win. So that's a pretty broad oversimplification. Don't get mad at me, people who listen to this. Why do I say when your cards are better than their cards? Well, that's because when your cards aren't better than their cards, you should really start thinking, well, what are they going to get when I cast this? So I get to play my Signet, which helps me play my commander, right? Well, if they already have their commander out and they have a Mystic Remora in play, they're just getting free stuff and they're getting further and further ahead of me. So I used to play a Feather deck in Commander, and whenever I played it, I couldn't feed the fish because my cards were so bad that it just didn't make any sense, because I'd cast a cantrip targeting Feather, which lets me put it back in my hand, and I'd probably just draw another cantrip, while my opponent probably drew gas because they're playing a much better deck than I am. So that's one angle to look at it from. And the other angle is just like, am I going to win right now? If you cast Flash into a Mystic Remora and they don't have any mana up, it really doesn't matter how many cards they draw. Eventually they might draw Force of Will, but it's pretty unlikely. And if you do the math and you realize, well, they might have to draw a blue card and a Force of Will, you might just say, I'm just going to try to win right now. Now, the problem is, if you feed the fish and you don't win, well, now you've just fed this player quite a bit, and now they're going to be ahead of the rest of the table and you.
One thing I think that's really important in that first section you were talking about, I've seen so many people, like an upsetting amount of people, sit there on their turn 1 and they have like a cantrip in their hand, something like a brainstorm. And instead of just holding on to the card, they decide that sculpting their hand is somehow going to advance them more than the cards that they're giving to the Mystic Remora player. And it just...
yeah, it's almost never true.
The math almost never adds up. Right. It is 9 times out of 10 a misnomer. You cannot sculpt with a cantrip better than giving them card advantage.
Yeah, you don't cast a turn 1 brainstorm if there's already a Mystic Remora in play. I can maybe see the argument for, drop your fetch land on turn 2, use your mana, the land you played on the first turn to play the brainstorm, then crack the fetch, shuffle some cards away. I can kind of see that because that is quite a bit of card advantage. You're getting more than 3 out of that, basically, because of the fetch land. But a Ponder, no. A Preordain, no. Honestly, you probably just want to play your commander. If you can play. That's why Mana Dorks are so good. They don't feed the fish. They're great for a lot of reasons, but that's one of the best reasons, is you can actually build your board state into a fish, which is very powerful.
I think that is actually one of the most interesting parts of cEDH in general, moving towards the partners and moving towards green as just a color they're playing a lot, is that there are cards like Mystic Remora that used to capitalize on things like all of our fast mana. Now we can move towards mana dorks or creatures in green and actually avoid cards like Mystic Remora that would normally shut down certain decks.
Yeah, it affects other stuff too. Like if you see a Thalia, your dorks don't get affected by that. Additionally, if you have partner commanders, another reason partner commanders are great. If your opponent has a turn 1 Mystic Remora, it's pretty easy for you to just go turn 2 Thrasios, turn 3 play Tymna, attack with Thrasios, probably at the player who played the Mystic Remora, because they're busy paying for that instead of progressing their own board state. Partners are broken, obviously, but that's one of the great things about them, is you can progress your board state through the Mystic Remora.
I think Mystic Remora is one of the cards that will probably punish you the most for really tough decisions. Sometimes you have to sit there with the hand and say, I'm gonna keep my Mystic Remora until turns 2 or 3. That way I can pay for it with the ability to still advance my board state. And yet, sometimes that ends up being the best move in the entire game. And sometimes that ends up being really rough because your opponent slams down 3 0-mana rocks. And you're sitting there thinking, oh my god, that's 3 cards I could have had in my hand. So I think playing with Mystic Remora, unfortunately, sometimes can be a gamble in that sense. So learning even just sometimes if you can know at the table that you're at when it's likely that you will be fed, when your fish will be fed, knowing what tables and what configurations will you be likely to get those cards, or what tables will you be likely to get those cards later in the game.
I think another interesting thing about Mystic Remora is that it feels like a card that gets worse as the game goes on, but there's a whole bunch of other cards that make it better. So if someone casts a Cyclonic Rift, one of my favorite things to do is just like tutor for, or if they bounce it back to my hand, it's even better. But if you can get a Mystic Remora out right after a Cyclonic Rift, like if you're the next person in turn order or it's your turn that they played it, it's very powerful because you can actually take advantage of your opponents building up their resources, and if you have enough mana out, you can redeploy your things and then get a huge amount of advantage with just paying 1 mana for it. Another cool thing with Mystic Remora is that sometimes you can just like regrowth it, replay it, and there's probably going to be a counter battle over it if your opponents are smart, but sometimes they can't, and then you just get a free Mystic Remora back using like a Noxious Revival or a regrowth. And the card is very powerful, so it's worth doing something like that.
One interesting nuance that I've noticed is, as I was talking about with Rhystic Study earlier, the 1 mana being so imperative as the game goes forward. Towards the later part of the game, say you've grinded to a halt with almost everyone at the table, Mystic Remora is actually overwhelmingly amazing in the later parts of the game because people, one, can't pay 4 mana. Despite what part of the game you're in, paying 4 mana
that's a card.
As a tax
That's
is
a card.
Absolutely ridiculous.
A card off Thrasios is 4 mana, or it's like a land drop. Like sometimes people are like, okay, so I pay 4 mana, I lose a card, but he's down a card. Is that worth it for me right now? And they have to think about that a lot. And there's not really a good answer. Yeah. It really depends on the board state, but it's good for you that your opponents are having to make these decisions.
I would say most games that I've played in competitive EDH end with a stack of like 8 cards. You know what I mean? Someone's jamming a counterspell here and then playing a Pact of Negation and then Force of Willing with that. Someone tries to play a Silence. That's Mental Misstep. And that happens towards the later parts of the game. So when you actually play a late Mystic Remora, oftentimes it can just be overwhelmingly powerful because people don't have the option of paying that 4 because everyone is at the point where if a spell resolves, the game's just done.
Another interesting thing is that there are decks that can't win through Mystic Remora.
Yes.
So, and if they do, they have to get rid of it at some point. So it does mean that they have to actually, think, and you might be able to get them as they like kind of have to dig for an answer to your Mystic Remoras before they can combo out.
So my actual example for this scenario is one that I lived in real life when I was at Command Fest DC. The card I had on the field was Rhystic Study instead of Mystic Remora, but it lived through the exact same example. So a person I was playing with in my pod was attempting to win through the Bomberman combo. The Bomberman combo is Auriok Salvagers and Lion's Eye Diamond. Basically, when you play that combo, Auriok Salvager says you can return an artifact to your hand for 1 and a white. Lion's Eye Diamond says discard your hand, make 3 mana of any color. That combo works because you crack your Lion's Eye Diamond, it goes to the graveyard, Auriok Salvagers is there, and it says for only 2 mana, you can recur it. You then generate infinite white mana, and then you generate infinite mana of any color, and then you win the game, usually through an outlet like Thrasios. When I was playing that game, my opponent failed to realize that my Rhystic Study actually prevented them from going off because they either had to A, let me draw a card every time they attempted to go through their loop, or B, had to pay for it and therefore were not generating any card advantage. So what ended up happening was the person attempted to go through their loop several times, realized that it wasn't enough, and then had given me enough cards to draw to win. Or sometimes it would have given me enough cards to just disrupt their combo and then win on my turn. So instead of being able to go for the win, my opponent actually gave the win to me by attempting to go through that combo. So in a sense, Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study can be on-board hate pieces in a sense.
They're almost stacks pieces, but Rhystic Study is way more of a stacks piece than Mystic Remora, but they can be at certain points in the game.
I completely agree. So the next card we want to talk about that has a lot of nuance to it is one we talked about to a good extent in our 2019 year in review. It's Dockside Extortionist. Braden, do you want to take it away?
Sure. We talked a lot about Dockside Extortionist, but I thought it'd be interesting to review some of the interesting things you can do with it, some of the commanders that it's powerful in, and explain why it's been so popular across so many different parts of the format. So first of all, Dockside Extortionist is a great ritual. Someone once said to me that Dockside Extortionist, making 4 treasures, is one of the best rituals ever printed. So if you think about it that way, a 2-mana sorcery that makes 4 treasured instead of makes 4 red mana is better than almost any ritual that's ever existed. That's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but just think about that in your head for a minute. Dockside Extortionist does that, but sometimes he makes 8 or 9 mana. And if your opponents have made treasures too, unless they sack them in response, he makes even more mana. So it's very powerful. Dockside Extortionist is a powerful ritual, obviously, but it's also even more powerful as a combo piece. So similar to Dramatic Reversal, where it doubles as a combo piece with Ice Crown Scepter and a ritual in the deck when you're needing to storm off, Dockside Extortionist can help you ritual out your entire combo, or it can at least put you ahead a little bit so you can get a nice footing in the game, and then later on it doubles as a combo piece. So the 2 cards people use with it to create a combo is Baron Master Wizard and Temur Sabertooth. Those are 2 creatures that bounce creatures to your hand. Baron Master Wizard can also bounce creatures to your opponent's hands, which is also very useful against a card like Collector Roof, which often shuts down the combo. So with Dockside Extortionist and those 2 cards, you actually get a red-green or red-blue infinite mana combo that is very powerful and very consistent. This allows those 2 color combinations to have a interesting combo that is creature-based, so the green creature tutors are very powerful, and it also allows for the combo to have very high creature quality. Temur Sabertooth and Dockside Extortionist and Baron Master Wizard are all very good creatures. Bouncing something to your hand is very useful, getting indestructible in response to a board wipe is pretty useful, and making tons of mana is really useful. So we've seen Dockside Extortionist actually change the format quite a bit before the Thassa's Oracle printing. I think some of the experimentation I've been incredibly impressed with is in the realm of reanimation. So infinitely reanimating your Dockside Extortionist, or using some reanimation tool as a ritual through Dockside Extortionist has been very impressive to me, and I'm excited to see where that goes in the future as more and more busted reanimation cards and effects like it get printed.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of people playing with that archetype lately, especially with Dockside, and I think it's a really great place, especially for the Rakdos colors, the black-red, to really advance their win conditions, because right now they really tend to rely on World Gorger Dragon. But having Dockside chains or Dockside combos is really interesting, and I love to see the color pushed a little more.
Yeah, red's great. I think it's a great color. I don't enjoy playing it in the 4-mana, but I'm always happy to see more red players and lose to Blood Moon, so...
Timna Crom.
Also...
Timna Crom.
Key note, this makes Godo way better, so that fills me with joy.
I feel like we've mentioned Godo once an episode now. Yeah, I think Dockside is one of those cards that we are just going to keep figuring out how amazing this card is. Like, every couple months, I feel like we find a brand new way for this card to be broken, and I think it is by far one of the fairest, but one of the best cards we've gotten in a really long time, and I adore it.
I don't know if it's fair. It's like ridiculously efficient.
It's a ritual.
Yeah, I wouldn't call
rituals, but it's a ritual.
Storm and rituals are not fair magic. Fair magic is like rampant growth.
The next card we're going to talk about is Angel's Grace. This is a 1-mana instant for only a single white, and it has Split Second, which is an ability that says as long as this spell is on the stack, players can't cast spells or activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. That's very important for this card before we even get to what the card exactly does. Split Second is extremely powerful in the fact that you cannot counter it, you cannot interact with it at all. Literally the only thing that can interact with a Split Second spell is a morph, which, hint hint, is not played a lot in our format.
Or a triggered ability. A triggered ability will go on the stack above Split Second. So a counterbalance can counter a Angel's Grace, but it does not come up very often.
The rest of the card after the Split Second ability says you can't lose the game this turn, and your opponents can't win the game this turn. Until the end of turn, damage that would reduce your life total to less than 1 reduces it to 1 instead.
Interestingly, this means that if you take 200 life off from an ad nauseum, you will go to negative life. But it also means you can't draw your whole deck with necropotence, because eventually you'll go to 0 life because you ran out of life to pay. But it also means you can't die to Aetherflux Reservoir because it'll prevent that damage. So Angel's Grace is really useful in the current meta because of a card called Thassa's Oracle. Thassa's Oracle has this triggered ability that goes in the stack, and if you can't win the game when it resolves, you won't win the game. And then you'll have a near empty library, or an empty library, and you'll have no trigger on the stack to win the game with. you'll have a Thassa's Oracle on the battlefield, and you'll have to pass the turn. So Angel's Grace is very useful because it combos with Ad Nauseam so effectively, while simultaneously preventing the most powerful deck in the format from being able to win, and it almost can't get countered.
The important part is, right now, compared to Laboratory Maniac and Jace, Wheeler of Mysteries, those are static abilities and therefore mean that even if the turn ends, you still have those abilities in play. Whereas Thassa's Oracle has a lot of advantages from having an enter the battlefield ability, but it does mean after that ability resolves, it is just a creature. It has nothing else on it because it only has that enter the battlefield ability. So Angel's Grace is really good tech in the current moment for stopping a Thassa's Oracle win condition.
The card's going to be seeing a lot more play, and it's also going to be making decks that play this card much more powerful.
It's very interesting because not only is it an instant that stops the best deck in the format, but it's an instant that generates a win in the best deck in the format. Because as we talked about with the Angel's Grace Ad Nauseam combo, when you play Angel's Grace and then resolve the Ad Nauseam, you can draw your entire deck. So having a card that is not only a win condition, but also is a hate piece for another deck is very powerful. And I think going forward, we're going to be seeing a lot of this card.
A warning about Angel's Grace and Ad Nauseam: if you do not win the game the turn you cast Angel's Grace and you've drawn your deck, it's very likely you'll have a negative life total. You'll lose the game at the beginning of your upkeep. It's not like a trigger on the stack. You'll just lose the game at the beginning of your upkeep, or the beginning of the next upkeep after the turn you cast Angel's Grace. That's because you have a life total below 0.
Right, it's not something you can respond to. As soon as the turn starts, you are just dead.
So you'll probably want to win the game the turn you draw your deck. If you can't, you'll probably lose. Or if you had like 5 cards in your deck, you'll still be alive probably. But it just depends. That's why you have to keep track of your cards you draw off your Ad Nauseam. Keep track of the life total, unless you're 100% sure you can win that turn.
I was talking with Shaper Savant this week, and we were talking about the power level of Angel's Grace. I think I personally overestimate the card. He was talking about a lot of the downsides of the card, and I think going forward, seeing where it lies in the format is going to be very interesting. If you feel that it really adds more winning percentage to your deck, it's an amazing piece to slot in, and you should definitely do that. I think that was the conclusion we landed on. However, playing it just as a hate piece to try and beat Thassa's Oracle is not going to work because there are a lot of ways in which you can play better outlets for that effect. And that's that on Angel's Grace. Let's move on to our next card, Sylvan Library. Now, this one is another card that was printed a very long time ago, so I'm going to check out the Oracle text. Sylvan Library is an enchantment for 1 and a green, which is crazy because it is one of the best card draw enchantments, and it's in green. The card says, at the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do, choose 2 cards in your hand drawn this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life or put the card on top of your library.
Okay, so some interesting things about Sylvan Library. I'm going to pull some stuff from the rulings page on Gather and explain to you maybe why it works this way. So, first of all, any cards drawn prior to Sylvan Library's ability of resolving, including in your upkeep or in response to the triggered ability, can be chosen to be put back using this effect. Sylvan Library's controller is responsible for keeping these cards distinguishable in hand, such as keeping them separate from cards that began the turn in the hand. So usually what this means is when you have a Sylvan Library in play, you keep a pile of cards you've drawn this turn, and you keep a pile of cards you haven't drawn this turn. The cards you have drawn this turn, usually it's only 1 card, you keep separate, and then you draw your 2 other after the Sylvan Library trigger resolves. You can flip them around, you can mix them all up, those 3 cards, you put any number of them back. Another interesting thing you can do is you can respond to the Sylvan Library trigger, because it is a triggered ability. So you can draw your card for turn, set it aside, but look at it, see, is this like a Mystical Tutor, is this any of those things. If you want to cast it, you can cast it. Let's say it's a Mystical Tutor, you search your library, you put the card on top, then you draw 2, and then if you want to keep either of those cards, you'd have to pay 4 life. So it is a trigger you can respond to. Sometimes if I have something I want to do during my draw step, or if I have a tutor I want to cast during my upkeep and I have a Sylvan Library in play, I might wait to draw a card for turn because it might provide information for me that is useful. Although if you're sensitive to your life total, you might want to not do that. But I had a game the other day, I won specifically because I waited to see what the top card was, and then I cast the Mystical Tutor. So in that case, I drew a Dark Ritual, I had the Mystical Tutor, I tutored for Ad Nauseam, drew the Ad Nauseam, then ripped the Ad Nauseam and won the game. Stuff like that it's useful to just at least go through your turn slowly. These are triggers. You can respond to them. And for Sylvan Library, it's especially important because you're manipulating the cards you're drawing, and that's the most important resource in the game.
Yeah, I think with a card like Sylvan Library, it's just important to remember that every step in the game is a trigger and a passive priority. And I think realizing exactly what your cards do in that sense, the fact that Sylvan Library triggers directly after you draw, your draw for turn cannot be interacted with on your draw step. So the Sylvan Library trigger happens, you hit your draw step, you draw that card, and now there's priority passed on that trigger. There's a lot of really interesting nuance that can happen in that time. And that's one of the reasons why we're talking about it today, because it's a very complicated card and it has a lot of small sequences you can do to really optimize your game.
Yeah, exactly. Let's say you're at a position where you're trying to put as many lands into play and rip through as much of your deck as possible so you can get some type of advantage and maybe find a combo piece you need or a tutor. And you rip the top 3 off your deck and you see a land, a card you don't want, and a card you do want. Let's just say it's like a Dispel. So you put the Dispel in your hand and you put the top 2 cards back. But you get to choose the order of those cards. So you put the card you don't want on the very top and the land right under it. So that way when you activate your Thrasios, you can actually just scry the top card to the bottom, then flip the land. Now you've gotten ahead on a card, and you've used your Sylvan Library as an ability basically to scry 2 during your turn, and you've also maybe gotten ahead a card that you wouldn't have originally. So it's important to, when you're playing Sylvan Library, realize that the actual ability to manipulate the top 3 cards of your deck during your draw step is very powerful, and you can actually create card advantage by planning ahead and putting cards on top. Sometimes you see 2 lands, and one's a fetch land and one's not a fetch land, and so you don't want to draw another land. So you draw the fetch land, you draw the spell, and then you crack the fetch to shuffle the other card away. That's a way for you to kind of get ahead of card. Now next time, you'll see 3 fresh new cards instead of the fetch land and 2 fresh new cards. So it's about just doing some optimizations on Sylvan Library the more you play with the card and realizing like the times where you can get ahead on cards.
Sylvan Library is probably the most complicated card we're going to talk about today, but one that we're going to talk about right now, and the last card we'll talk about today, that has a lot of really fun nuance and a lot of really interesting game state analysis is Chain of Vapor. I'm going to read you the Oracle text. Chain of Vapor is an instant for only a single blue that says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Then, that player's controller may sacrifice a land. If the player does, they may copy this spell and choose a new target for the copy. Basically speaking, if I'm playing a game with Braden and I bounce one of his permanents to his hands, he has the option to then sack one of his lands and bounce one of my permanents. It goes back to me. I think, well, I don't want him to have another permanent, so I sack one of my lands and bounce his. And this can keep going until eventually someone decides that they do not want to sacrifice a land, and therefore the spell stops.
Chain of Vapor used to be a very popular Storm card. So imagine you're playing your Aetherflux Reservoir, and you have like 6 0-mana rocks. Each time you cast one of those rocks, your Storm count goes up, and you gain even more life. So with Chain of Vapor, you can sacrifice 5 lands, and then put all 6 of those rocks back right into your hand, and then recast them because they're 0-mana rocks. Additionally, I want to make sure it's very clear, the lands don't have to be untapped. They can be tapped. You can actually sacrifice one of your tapped lands and bounce someone else's permanent to their hand. So, in addition to being a very powerful Storm card, Chain of Vapor is a very efficient removal spell. It does have that cost of allowing your opponents to start chaining permanents, but that can also be a benefit.
Sometimes a really important scenario that comes up with Chain of Vapor is one where you can gain incidental value. Say you're playing against an opponent who's about to go off with Food Chain, and they only have enough mana to play their Food Chain and then sacrifice their Squee the Immortal to it, which will allow them to generate infinite mana. So you know that their Food Chain has to be bounced with Squee on the stack. However, you see your other opponent has a Jace Wielder of Mysteries on the battlefield, and they could maybe win at any time. But right now, the important part is the Food Chain opponent is about to win with their Squee Food Chain combo. What you can do with Chain of Vapor is target the Jace Wielder of Mysteries. In this scenario, you're actually forcing the person who has the Jace to sacrifice one of their lands and copy the Chain of Vapor to target the Food Chain. That way, if the Chain of Vapor resolving, targeting Food Chain is so important that the game will end if that doesn't happen, you can actually target your opponent's permanents that are not the player winning to force them to use the Chain of Vapor copy and sacrifice a land to make them hit the correct target. This is very important because it can turn what is a removal spell saving you from losing into a piece that actually hits multiple threatening items on the battlefield.
There are some problems with this strategy, though. Notably, if the opponent who controls the Jace Wielder of Mysteries determines that it's more likely another player has a piece of interaction than not, they may say, I'm going to counter the Chain of Vapor, and let's say they had a mental misstep. I'm going to counter the Chain of Vapor so I can still win during my next turn, and they're going to test the table and see if the table has another piece of interaction. Sometimes the table doesn't, and you die. Sometimes you're able to win because you were extremely greedy. You really have to get a read on the opponent. For example, in some decks, lands are extremely valuable, and without them, you will not be able to keep up and you will lose the game. Those decks might not be willing to sacrifice a land and lose their most important permanent. While in other decks, a land isn't a big deal. The Gitrog monster isn't going to really care if they lose a land, unless it's the Gitrog monster you target, which is probably what you are targeting. The Gitrog monster doesn't actually mind losing lands. They can play multiple lands a turn, they can play lands from the graveyard, so getting behind on lands isn't a big deal for them. So they're more likely to make that trade. Additionally, it's a bit of a player judgment. If you know the players you're playing with, you might know that some people don't play this game very well, and there are some players you know that always play the game because in their mind it's the optimal play. So you really do have to evaluate the table. If the people you're playing with don't ever play along and you lose often because of this, you should probably have a conversation about why you're playing the format this way, because in a lot of groups that is kind of a core fundamental agreement, is that you make plays like that and you don't make decisions based off of spite.
Mm-hmm. In cEDH, you are trying to win the game, and spite plays are considered something that is outside of the format.
Arguing that I'm just building a character so that you know not to try to pull that stuff on me is considered pretty toxic, pretty widely, and it really isn't acceptable behavior according to most. I, as an individual, have a hard time determining if Chain of Vapor is as good as people think it is. As a one-mana bounce spell, it's very powerful. And as a political tool, like we kind of covered, it's also very powerful. On the other hand, there are a lot of times where I get pretty concerned that it's not a good enough card. For example, in medium green, we're very permanent based. We have a lot of permanents and they're all very valuable, and our lands are also very valuable. So I'm very unlikely to play along with this game. I don't want to lose lands. The thing you're bouncing in my hand probably cost a lot of mana for me to put there, and losing a land is just a huge tempo swing in that deck. So I really don't play along with this game when I play that deck. Other decks, I totally play along. Medium green has a harder time playing that game. And so I wonder if it's a card I'm even supposed to be playing in some of my own decks, because I know that because I don't play the game, if they try to bounce something of mine back, it's just a huge blowout.
Yeah, and I've noticed with Stacks decks, they really also have a hard time playing Chain of Vapor. One thing that I find very interesting with Theros Beyond Death, we got Stern Dismissal, which is an instant that says you can return a creature or enchantment an opponent controls to their hand, which is the most efficient version of that effect that we've gotten in a really long time. So for certain decks, specifically like Stacks or like your medium green list, I would actually take a peek at Stern Dismissal as a very high value removal piece.
I think the thing Chain of Vapor bounces the most often is creatures Jace, Wielder of Mysteries, and enchantments. So it's very close, but the thing that I appreciate about Chain of Vapor is the fact it hits Jace, Wielder of Mysteries. Jace dodges Abrupt Decay,
I completely
and so
agree.
Having that extra piece that hits Jace is like just absolutely the most valuable thing. Most of the time, they can't even really take advantage of the Chain of Vapor because they're just about to die because you bounce their Jace in response to a draw trigger.
The next thing we wanted to talk about is the fact that Playing with Power, the very popular YouTube channel focused on competitive EDH, has combined their resources to make a list of staples based on the cEDH decklist database, and these lists of staples compile the most commonly played cards in the cEDH format according to our decklist database. Braden, do you want to go into more detail on that?
Sure. So the staple list was curated from the decklist database. So it is made up of over 100 decks with a sample size of over 9,500 cards. It is basically a list of the most popular cards in the format, and it's a general look at how new cards enter and leave popularity. So, for example, Thassa's Oracle pops up in 11 decks as of Wednesday, January 22nd. That's a pretty interesting number because the set isn't even out yet, and it's already found in 11 decks on the decklist database. So if that's the kind of information you're interested in, I would go check that out. We're interested in talking more about it, but we just had so much to talk about in those other categories that we ran out of time.
Yeah, I think the staple list is very interesting, and The difference in the past 20 days between the pre-Thassa's Oracle world, the previous version of the list, and what we are looking at now is very interesting to look at. So if you really want to take a dive into the cards that define our format, we would love for you to take a look at this list. And it's really amazing that those guys took the time to really separate this list out and make it available for people. And we will definitely include the link in the show notes. Speaking of the lovely people over at Playing with Power, they have also taken the suggestion sent by our own Braden, and they are going to be playing his baby, the medium green consultation list that he has been piloting for several months now. Braden, do you want to talk about the list and how you got it on there?
So Playing with Power did a Patreon viewer submitted deck list challenge or event or whatever they're calling it, and they decided that one of the decks they're going to play is medium green. And I'm not saying it's nepotism, but I may have harassed some people in the admin channel on the Discord. I'm not saying I did, but I hope you guys can't see the history. So I'm really excited for them to be playing medium green. It's one of my favorite decks. It's a deck I've put a lot of time and energy into just optimizing and trying to find the better play patterns and testing out cards that you really don't see anywhere else. It's a really fun deck, and I'm really excited to see someone else play it. Although I have had one person borrow it before, and it is kind of infuriating when they don't know that Eldritch Evolution gets the Seedborn Muse. So I hope he's able to figure that out. But pretty excited.
Yeah, I'm really excited for you to have your lists and be able to display it in a popular place because I know personally how hard you've worked on it.
Man.
So next we're going to talk about something also within your world, and we're going to talk about the cEDH tournament down in Philadelphia that I will officially now be attending.
Yay! I'm clapping with my hands out clapping.
Yay!
So the cEDH tournament is going to be in Phoenixville, Pennsylvania, just outside Philly, and we have an excellent group of guests. Shaper Savant, Scotty from Team Turn 3 and Scotty Knows Gaming, and we're announcing, or just announced, that Casually Competitive is going to be coming to the event. So they're the new YouTube channel. If you have not seen them, you should check them out. They're very, very high quality, and they have a really nice like Hawaiian bar aesthetic, and I'm a pretty big fan. I like the Hawaiian shirts and all that. Pretty big fan. In addition to that, Ian's going to be there, which is pretty exciting. Ernesto from the 99 is going to be there. Also very exciting. It's going to be one of the bigger events in the community this whole year. It might even be bigger than GP New Jersey, which is pretty nuts.
Yeah, I'm very excited for the tournament, and I'm very excited to lose to Fish Hulk.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how many people actually show up with Fish Hulk, because there are a lot of people who know it's powerful, but there are also a lot of people who have years of experience on other decks, and so experience is going to be relevant.
Yeah, in all seriousness, I think it's going to be a really amazing tournament, and the fact that you guys are putting it on and really making cEDH a tournament space is really fantastic. And I know as a person who loves playing in tournaments and being able to play my formats in a competitive space, it's really amazing.
I'm actually a pretty big believer that cEDH is a casual format. However, I think that it's good that we have opportunities to see each other and just, actually play like in a tournament. I don't think that's what the format is meant for. I don't think the ban list should be catered to this type of event, but I do think it's exciting that we're doing this, and I think it's a good excuse to get the community to all come in one place. I have some announcements about the prizes. So each player who gets into the top 4 is going to be getting $40 and a top 4 playmat, which is actually a beautiful playmat. I'm pretty sure, cannot confirm it has stitched edges, but it might. Additionally, the winner will get an additional $90, and they will get a winner's playmat, which is a one-of-a-kind playmat that no one else has. Finally, throughout the event, we will have feature matches, which is where you can basically play with famous people, well-known people in the community who are really important to making stuff happen. So people like Shaper, Scotty, Casually Competitive, all those people will have booths where you can meet them, get stuff signed. Some of them will be giving things away. Some of them will be just playing games all day. And if you win, you'll get special prizes like brawl decks and packs and playmats and stuff like that. So it's going to be a really fun event. It's going to be a really big event. A lot of it, the money is going to be going to charity for Extra Life. And I'm really excited.
Yeah, it's going to be really amazing. I'm very excited to be a part of it.
I'm glad you are. I hope as many people who see this can come down and have a good time. We're going to be doing more of these events. We already have the second one planned. We're going to be giving away secret information at the actual event. So I'm excited to talk about that.
And what's the site where people can find more on that?
It's ddmgaming.com. ddmgaming.com. I'm running this tournament with my friend Mike, and we're going to be running it under the DDM Gaming brand, which is really exciting. This is going to be the first cEDH tournament under the DDM Gaming brand, and it's been extremely successful. We're planning on doing way more.
So the next couple of weeks are pretty crazy for opportunities to play Commander in a big space. I'm going to be attending New Jersey.
I'll be at New Jersey too.
And the week after that's Philly, the tournament for the DDM Gaming. So I think it's going to be a very exciting opportunity for the next couple of weeks as far as competitive EDH. All right, everyone. And that concludes our 4th episode of the cEDH cast. Before we sign off, Braden, do you want to hit us with our social media whereabouts?
Sure. So you can find us at cEDHcast on Twitter, on Instagram, on Patreon, and on Spotify. And we're also on Google Podcasts. And we're also on YouTube now, so you might be hearing us from there. We're also on SoundCloud. You can find us on SoundCloud at cEDHcast, and that's about everything.
Great. We're really excited to be on all these places so that you guys have any comfort and availability to be able to download the cast. And as we said, if there's any place that would make it a little easier for you, feel free to reach out to us on our Discord or through email. Thank you all so much for your attention to this podcast. The community has grown in a way that we can be only so thankful for. Really, from the bottom of our hearts, thank you for listening, and we are excited to create more and more content for you each week. So, from cEDH Cast, hope you have a wonderful week.
Wonderful week, guys.
Bye.